So my next speaker is Dominic Hardy. He's a professor of Quebec and Canadian art history at the Université de Québec et Montréal, where he leads two research teams, Caricature and Satire Graphique et Montréal, and l'équipe de recherche en histoire de l'art au Québec, as well as the laboratory numérique d'études sur l'histoire de l'art au Québec. His work on Quebec graphic satire and art history has been published in Canadian and European books and journals. He was the co-editor with Annie Guerin and Jean-Philippe Uzel of a special issue of Racard on humor and visual arts and culture in 2012, which was brilliant. Among several projects due to be published in a brief synopsis of Quebec art history, prepared for the second edition of Quebec Questions, Quebec Studies for the 21st Century for Oxford University Press. He's also working on a study of the influence of William Hogarth in America for Yale University Press. Later this year, he's publishing with FIDS in Montreal from the proceedings of a conference organized in 2013 with Michelin Cambron of Baptiste and Catherine Ladebauche. Is that correct? Okay. Welcome, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Thank you very much. It's okay? Don't move it, okay. If I may, I'd just like to say, well, as a very quick preface to what I'm about to read to you, that if you've read the abstract, you may be expecting something slightly different than what I'm actually going to say. And here's why, very quickly. Indeed, when I proposed this talk, I was thinking very much about the équipe de recherche en histoire de l'art du Québec. We're building a database. We're looking forward to writing the first survey of Quebec art history. And I thought that what I could do was go to the database in construction, and as they keep on telling me back at the ranch, it's not a database yet, it's just the data. And ask it a set of questions about practices by Quebec women artists around self-portraiture, and then come to you with the results of that and weave it into a large narrative. I can't yet. But it led me to what I'm going to present to you, and to a new question. So it served its purpose. If there's time in the question period, I have a couple of extra slides that I can show you, which will just illustrate why it took this turn. Okay, right, here I go. So the story I have to tell you today begins with a sheet of comments set down in April 1992 by the Montreal artist Gita Kaiserman-Roth, who was born in 1923 and whose career stretches from the years of World War II till her passing in 2005. The comments were addressed to Rosemarie Tavel, then the curator of Canadian prints and drawings at the National Gallery of Canada. Tavel was assembling the materials for her proposal to acquire 12 of Kaiserman-Roth's prints for the National Gallery collection. And here we go. Is that working? Yes, good. Excuse me. Kaiserman-Roth's comments were annexed to Tavel's argument for acquisition. Of all of these comments, here is the one that explains the image that you see on the screen right now. During the war years, wrote Gita Kaiserman-Roth, I studied in New York and would come back to Montreal during the summers to work in the war plants. I worked on both day and night shifts. This etching is a self-portrait in a dream about the shell examining I did. My feet are in water, the shells have wings and are flying around, and this gives the etching a surreal quality, end of quote. A self-portrait in a dream, in a space marked by surrealism, to be sure, in a space whose narrative structure also recalls the early Renaissance. A self-portrait in three stages perhaps. Closest to us, Gita Kaiserman, as she still was in 1943, at 20 years of age, with her feet indeed in water, standing or sitting at a conveyor belt, examining the artillery shells at a war plant, perhaps the British munitions factory in Verdun, first set up in 1916 and reestablished by Defense Industries Limited in December 1940, as we can glean from the promotional material produced by Talon Books for Montreal playwright David Fenario's 2014 work, Mother House. It's worth a small quote from Fenario's publisher, a quote informed by the research of Serge Durfingler. Quote, consisting of two small plants and having 250 employees at the outset, it became operational in May 1941, producing limited quantities of TNT and cordite for ammunition. By 1943, so the date of this etching, the factory had been renovated with subsidies from the Canadian government to include 40 new buildings and rail sidings that linked the factory directly to train lines. DIL Verdun obtained contracts and guidelines from the Department of Munitions and Supply. Its primary client was the Canadian government, though the factory supplied ammunition to other allied nations as well. End of quote. The photograph on the cover of Mother House gives us a sense of mimetic correspondence to certain aspects of Kaiserman's etching. The munitions workers, who evidently came to number 6,800 in all at the height of production, sport the same wide-collared white overalls as the three Gitas, if I can call them that. Their heads, also just like a Gita in three spaces, are covered with a white cap which for each of the self-portraits frames a face that indeed bears a resemblance to the face that greets us in self-portraits and portraits of Gita Kaiserman from this period. The self-portrait from 1939, already an accomplished and strong handling of her own body and face, both framed by a landscape of squiggly skiers set in some pastel Laurentian or Mount Royal winter sport fantasy. What I contrast here across the detail from Night Shift with an etched portrayal by Fred Taylor, made some 10 years later. The strong eyebrows, the stern expression, the diamond mouth, and the well-defined jawline, and in both Night Shift and Taylor's portrayal of the fringe-cut hair, enable us to establish a repertoire of Gita Kaisermans. In 1949, she had become Gita Kaiserman Pinsky. During her time in New York, she had met Alfred Pinsky, like her, a dedicated left-wing activist. Rosemary Tavel's acquisitions report gives us the overall context of these years, and she writes to the Acquisitions Committee, among the artists active during the Second World War, Gita Kaiserman Roth stands alone in her depiction of biting socio-political commentaries on the war. Her political activism and outlook were acquired during her student years in New York from 1939 to 1944. There she studied with such left-wing artists as the twins Raphael and Moses Sawyer and Harry Sternberg at the Art Students League. Kaiserman Roth's 1943 and 44 prints were pulled during Harry Sternberg's print classes at the Art Students League. Because she had only limited access to the printmaking facilities, Kaiserman Roth was not only able to print very small editions, the largest being not more than 8. They were not really meant for commercial release, and, with the exception of Night Shift, were never exhibited. Night Shift was exhibited at the Art Association of Montreal's Spring Exhibition in 1943. Apparently, these prints were first shown in 1987 at the exhibition Jewish Painters in Modernity, Montreal, 1930-1945, mounted by the Sadie Bronfman Center. End of quote. Well, here Rosemary Tavel refers to a groundbreaking exhibition that was organized by my colleague Esther Trépanier. It proved to be a major step forward in our understanding of the contributions made by Montreal's largely immigrant Jewish community to the development of modernist art practices in the city and in Quebec and Canadian art more largely. Building in part on the landmark Canadian Painting of the 30s exhibition organized by Charles C. Hill in 1973, the Jewish Painters in Modernity project enabled Trépanier to undertake extensive first-hand research among the artists, men and women, many of whom had been active in the 1930s and were still working in the 1980s when she did the project. 20 years later, Trépanier was able to revisit the project, first in order to update and enrich the long out of print catalog, and second in order to organize a new exhibition entitled Jewish Painters of Montreal, Witnesses to Their Time, 1930 to 1948. This exhibition was subsequently presented at the McCord Museum in Montreal. In this context, Trépanier presented Kaiserman Roth's work chiefly in a section devoted to the topic of artists and the war, alongside Harry Mayarovich, Mo Reinblatt, and Louis Molstock, and at the end of the book in a section entitled The Next Generation, Early Work, a biographical presentation. The 2008 version of Trépanier's exhibition went even further in showing the significant contributions made by women artists to the engagement with modernist art practices in the Montreal environment. In this, Trépanier was following in her own footsteps. In 1998, and I've just got a little, there we are, tribute to Esther's work. Her study of painting in Quebec 1919-1939 surveyed not only the visual record left behind by the generation of Prudence Heward, Lilias Torrance Newton, John Lyman, Edwin Holgate, Louis Molstock, Jacques Bieder, Adrien Hébert, and so many others working with landscape, cityscape, portraiture, and incipient abstraction. in those interwar years, but crucially, she engaged systematically with all of the major Anglophone and Francophone critics of the period to describe for the first time the context of reception of these practices. 2 years later, her study of Marion Dale Scott provided again both an exhibition and a monograph that established a full retrospective critical examination of a major 20th century career. Later, as director of the Musée des Beaux-Arts du Québec in 2008 to 11, Esther Trépanier initiated a joint exhibition catalog series devoted to establishing a new dissemination program for studies in Quebec art history. The first of these initiatives was the project Femmes Artistes du Québec au XXe siècle, a survey that began with a generation of Helen McNichol and came up to the present time with artists such as Betty Goodwin, Geneviève Cadieux, and Dominic Blanc, to name just three. For the section of the 20th century that falls within the long historical span under consideration by this conference, this catalog is, of course, a rich reference in every respect, and given our topic in terms of what it shows us in terms of self-portrait. To the varied practice shown by Gita Kaiserman, and here I update the slide shown earlier to include a 1960 self-portrait of Rosebush, we can add other images from the period. Now, these are all from the collection of the Musée national des Beaux-Arts du Québec. I'm not pretending to a comprehensive survey of self-portraiture, but still, it's remarkable to see just how much self-portraiture by Quebec women artists has been collected by that museum. In the case of Mimi Parent, for example, best known for her surrealist constructions, the Matissean self-portrait of 1945 on the left comes almost as a shock. Other self-portraits by women artists in the period show a strong sense of resolve. Suzanne Duquet, and this work is in the wonderful show over at the Agnes Etherington Art Center. Le Groupe, who would go on to be a highly influential teacher at UQAM, my institution, includes herself as the governing figure of the artist in this early group portrait. This concern with what seems to be a reorientation of the relationship between artist and model is pursued in a different way by Sylvia Ari, who is the half-dressed figure gazing back at us beyond her model, her husband, a gaze that becomes a familiar psychological engagement that goes beyond questions of likeness, as we can see in an earlier, perhaps more traditional self-portrait of Sylvia Ari's, in which a sense of challenge to the viewer seems to emerge. Remarkably, the same is true also of two self-portraits by Rita Briansky, made at some 10 years interval. The first, from 1942, an intense blend of expressionist brushwork delivered across a sort of Chaim Soutine-like palette, but quite individual for Rita Briansky, gives way in 1953 to a stark rendition that pits the darkness of charcoal against the highlighting of dry pastel, the purpose of the work inscribed across the area of the artist's jacket. Something is definitely afoot in these works. It will take many more in-depth studies. Just one important endeavor would be to pick up where Esther Trépanier left off in 1948 in order to follow the Jewish women artists throughout their careers. In a sense, the work Trépanier carried out with the Femmes Artistes du Québec au XXe siècle project is a crucial step in that direction. A project that would accord attention to Gita Kaiserman-Roth would perhaps begin with the prints from the 1940s collected by the National Gallery in 1992, from among which the beguiling Night Shift still retains the enigmatic structure which across which Gita Kaiserman distributes three instances of her likeness. And what of this enigma? What of this dream image, this playfully, somewhat erotic meditation that in all kinds of ways seems to hearken forward to the work of our contemporary, another UQAM painting teacher, Cynthia Girard. Here, there is a fascinating reversal at play between Kaiserman's Night Shift and Sylvia Ari's artist and model. In Ari's case, the artist's back and backward glancing face inscribes the sign of skin, nudity, and erotic tension through the configuration of roles ascribed to artist and sitter. For Kaiserman, it's the fishing figure at upper left, sitting legs apart, legs bare, fishing pole emerging away to hoist and swing the phallic munition shells from one seated Gita stationed at the conveyor belt that is both inside and outside the factory structure that forms her backdrop, to another seated in what seems to read as a meadow, giving onto a fenced rise at the left, a hillet at the right. Up here, the fisherwoman appears to be the dreamer, her head wrapped not only in the factory cap, but in a mist surrounded by stars, dotting a night and day sky. There are two directions in which I could go from here, and in reaching some kind of conclusion, for now, I'd like to invoke one and then the other. It seems to me that on the very partial record drawn up by the sequence of images I've presented to you so far, it might be fair to say that women artists Quebec were exploring in the 1940s a range of new strategies that would allow them to investigate for themselves what the traditional conception of the self-portrait had to offer. The rehearsal of the likeness of one's own, and the willingness to redistribute that likeness in reconfigurations of those traditional conceptions of physical and symbolic space. Guy de Keyserman's early work also seems to point to an interest in place. Laurentian Mountains, Mount Royal, the British Munitions Factory in Verdun are called on as vectors of identity for the social and political landscape through which the artist seeks to define herself. To define herself, perhaps, but also to define her experience. One of the most well-known examples of this connection between the artist's sense of her own body and its place within a meaningful symbolic space, a meaning-making symbolic space that we have from the 1940s, is Françoise Sullivan's documented dance performance work of 1948, Danse dans la neige, a work that she later titled as such. Two photographs from the series taken by Maurice Perron on a very cold and sunny day in February 1948 of Françoise Sullivan performing her improvised choreography in tribute to the season of winter, the work that she would later title Danse dans la neige. In 2007, Louise Derry and the Galerie de l'UQAM produced, in collaboration with the artist, a reenactment of this project under the title The Sullivan Seasons. The Sullivan's winter performance was intended as one of 4 dance interventions in both countryside and city, just as they had been planned in the first place. After telling the story of the filming of the first project, Summer, at Les Escoumins in 1947 by Sullivan's mother, a 16mm film now lost, Louise Derry continues, and I quote, "When winter came, it was snowy mountain scenery near Mount Saint-Hilaire that provided the backdrop of the second segment. While the destiny of Quebec modernity was being played out in that month of February 1948, this is the era of Refus Global, Françoise Sullivan created the second season. This time, her witnesses and accomplices were 2 friends who, like her, were part of the automatiste movement and signatories of Refus Global, Jean-Paul Riopel and Maurice Perron. The choreography, which had not yet been given the title Danse dans la neige, was executed in a landscape of lunar cold and boreal lighting," end quote. Sullivan herself recalled the day in her text, Je précise, that she wrote for the first publication of photographs as an album under the name she gave the series in 1977. I quote, "On that day, all the countryside seemed to whisper. The brisk air reddened our cheeks. The ground was rough and sturdy under our feet. The snow looked like age-old glaciers. Some winter birds passed by overhead and dry weeds crackled under our feet. I let the movements come, vigorous in the cold. Their physical source as they grew accentuated themselves in their own emotive logic. I danced with light feet on the rough slopes of winter. I turned round in the cold wind and ran under the sun. The sun became overcast at afternoon's end, and the gestures became evocative of northern melancholy. I let rhythms flow. I perceived the space of day, cut it, and shaped it," end quote. Through both Night Shift and Danse dans la neige, I think it's possible to posit at the very least that women artists in Quebec were tackling what it is that representation of self can do in terms of structuring into the very conception of the artistic image, a redefinition, certainly a reworking at the very least, of its psychic and phenomenological structures and purposes. The 1940s certainly seemed like fertile ground for more study. It's tempting to read these works for the types of preoccupation with medium, performance, and iconology that will be more and more explored from the 1960s onwards. It's tempting to see Guy de Keyserman and Françoise Sullivan as pioneers of the approaches to the use of figuration that will lead to a wide range of artistic explorations, many of which have yet to be fully documented and assessed against the prevailing emphasis on abstraction that has so marked this period, although it should be said that even Sullivan's fellow Refus Global signatory, Marcel Ferron, will give us this self-portrait in 1967. In 2007, art historian Edith Anne Pajot published the article Paysage, dépaysement, la construction de mythes identitaires dans l'art canadien moderne et contemporain in the International Journal of Canadian Studies. Looking at post-1960s concern with ecology and many contemporary artistic practices, Pajot described the loss of nation as a strong cultural referent in Canadian art since Bourdieu, since Refus Global, although she found the loss to be gradual and to be part of a shifting sense of priorities. She said, "It has to be said that throughout the 1960s, the nation could still be a structuring referent of identity, capable of regulating other referents such as class ethnicity, sexual identity, or generational position, among others, end quote. Edith-Anne Pajot's remarks make no claim for self-portraiture, but in considering these remarks while meditating on works such as Night Shift and Danse dans la Neige, I think we can still pay attention to the where that is restaged in these images, where it is that we're going to find ourselves, the where of Northrop Frye's Where is Here. Here, it turns out, is where the body is inscribed, a body of the symbolic order of the artist as person, a body of the symbolic order of the collectivité as well. In Quebec art, across the decades and across centuries, artists turn time and time again to these spaces in order to assist in the construction of a symbolic order. In Joseph Légaré's time, in the 1830s, some idea of the nation and its collectivité is articulated through the young betuqued man reclining in possession and possessed of his emblematic nature, his ontological reality as being physically and linguistically made to mean this land. It's the encoding of a social order for Quebec in the 1830s. In the 1940s, a world and more later, this order has been many times recast, fashioning her personal and political identity as an engaged communist artist between Montreal and New York in wartime. Gita Kaiserman's triple self-portrait seems to locate, I'll just go to here, there we are, sexual experience and imagination, together with a historical imagination that is partly fashioned by the individual's political experience of her home city that has become the site for the industrial production of lethal weaponry. In negotiating the changes to the social and political order of Quebec in the immediate post-war world, Françoise Sullivan's performance was the creation of a powerful visual phenomenon that crossed her dance training with the poetry of a photographic engagement with Quebec landscape at Mont-Saint-Hilaire. In both cases, the body is at stake in the construction of meaning. No other body but that of the artist, represented, verified, reenacted through mimesis, resemblance, renewed encodings for the constant craving for likeness and recognition of the distributed image of the self, or indeed, the image of the distributed self, imagining itself at work in the world. Thank you.